Usually when you talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of, well, absolute precision.
Oh, definitely. People expect certainty.
Right. I mean, it feels like engineering. If you fall and break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, there it is.
Yeah, or if you're dealing with type 1 diabetes, they do a blood test.
Exactly.
They measure a specific biological quantity, and you have your answer. It's a binary system.
It's clean, it's visible, and frankly, it's incredibly comforting to have that kind of certainty.
It is, because as humans, we desperately want things to be perfectly categorized. Your blood sugar is either high or it's normal.
Right.
We want to know exactly what gear in the machine is malfunctioning so we can fix it.
But then you step into the world of mental health, and suddenly that x-ray machine is it's entirely broken.
Completely useless.
Yeah. The lab results come back blank. And today, we are looking at a massive stack of sources for you. Everything from the history of diagnostic manuals to the infamous 1970s Rosenhan experiment.
And some recent scientific critiques from the National Institute of Mental Health, too.
Yeah, that too. And what all these sources reveal is that mental health diagnoses are fundamentally completely different from diagnosing physical diseases.
Totally different.
There's no blood test, there is no brain scan, and there is no genetic marker for any diagnosis in the manual that psychiatrists use.
None. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
It really is.
And our goal for this deep dive is to wade right into those waters. We're going to unpack the DSM, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
The big psychiatric rule book.
Exactly, the American Psychiatric Association's shared rulebook. We're going to explore how clinicians actually define and diagnose mental disorders today.
And expose that massive gap between the symptom checklists they use and the actual biological reality of the human brain.
Right.
And if you're out there wondering why you should care about a psychiatric rulebook, just think about the ripple effects in your own life or, the lives of people you love.
It touches everything.
It really does.
Yeah.
Getting a diagnosis right or getting it wrong cascades into almost every corner of everyday life. I mean, it dictates what treatments are recommended.
It dictates what your insurance will actually pay for.
Yes. It decides whether a student gets academic accommodations.
Or if a disability claim gets approved.
Or even how competency is judged in a court of law. It's literally the ultimate gatekeeper.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this. If a psychiatric diagnosis isn't a biological measurement, what is actually happening in that doctor's office? Like, are they just guessing?
Well, not guessing exactly, but they are operating under a totally different framework.
Okay.
To understand this, we have to look at the fundamental difference between a disease and a syndrome.
Which people mix up all the time.
Constantly. In medicine, the word disease implies that we know the specific causal mechanism. We know the exact broken part, like a virus or a mutated cell.
Right.
But a syndrome is just a cluster of symptoms that tend to occur together. We don't necessarily know why they're happening.
So psychiatric diagnosis today is basically descriptive.
Almost entirely descriptive. It is not causal.
Okay, so when a clinician diagnoses someone using the DSM or its global counterpart, the WHO's ICD-11, which I know most global health systems use for a billing, they aren't claiming to have found a broken gear in the brain.
No, not at all.
They're just saying, hey, your reported experiences match this descriptive checklist.
Exactly. And the way those checklists are structured is what really surprises people. The DSM uses a polythetic approach.
Right. And looking at the sources, this is where the math gets a little wild.
It really does.
Because you don't need to have all the symptoms to get the label.
Yeah.
I think the DSM-5-TR, the current text revision, says for something like major depressive disorder, a patient only needs to show 5 out of 9 listed symptoms for at least 2 weeks.
Correct. And because it's polythetic, the combinations can vary wildly.
It almost feels like ordering off a menu, right?
That's a great way to put it.
Because if you pick 5 of the 9 items on that symptom menu, and I pick a completely different 5 items, we could literally share only one single overlapping symptom.
Yeah, just one.
Like, I might be agitated and unable to sleep, and you might be totally lethargic and sleeping all day. But we both walk out of the clinic with the exact same label on our medical record.
Yes. What's fascinating here is that this gap reveals one of the biggest misconceptions in mental health.
Which is?
Well, people naturally assume that if two people have the same diagnosis, they must have the exact same underlying biological problem.
Oh, right, because they share the same word.
Exactly. But mathematically, there are dozens of different ways to meet the criteria for major depressive disorder.
Wow.
You and I could look entirely different clinically, experience entirely different daily struggles, and receive the exact same label. The assumption of uniformity is just, well, it's false.
That is wild. So if the criteria are at loose today, how do we even settle on this system? Did someone just sit down in a room and decide this mix and match approach was the best way to categorize the human mind?
To find that origin story, we actually have to go back to the 1880s.
Okay, way back.
Yeah, to a German psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin. Before Kraepelin, psychiatric categorization was practically non-existent. It was chaotic,
Just a free-for-all.
basically. But he started sorting illnesses not just by taking a snapshot of a patient's current symptoms, but by tracking their course over time.
Oh, right. He was the one who made the famous split between dementia precox, which we now call schizophrenia, and manic depressive insanity. Right.
The one.
Because he noticed schizophrenia seemed to have this progressive, deteriorating course, while the manic depressive patients would actually recover between their episodes.
Exactly. Kraepelin introduced this course-based categorical thinking. He thought he was charting distinct biological diseases, even if he didn't have the tools to see the biology yet.
Which makes sense for the 1880s.
But if we jump forward to 1952, when the first DSM was published, things had shifted entirely.
Yeah, I read the excerpts from DSM-I and DSM-2 in the sources, and it is almost hard to believe doctors actually use them.
They're quite something. DSM-I was just a thin 130-page pamphlet.
And there are no bullet points,
Yeah.
no symptom counts.
No, it was heavily influenced by the U.S. military, since a lot of the authors were military psychiatrists classifying soldiers post-World War II,
Right.
and by psychoanalysis, which absolutely dominated American psychiatry at the time.
Yeah, the descriptions are just these incredibly vague narratives rooted in psychoanalytic theory. Stuff about unconscious conflicts and defense mechanisms.
It was incredibly subjective. You weren't looking at observable behaviors so much as you were trying to infer the hidden unconscious state of the patient's mind.
Which means if I went to 5 different doctors in the 1960s, I'd probably get 5 different diagnoses based entirely on how they personally interpreted my dreams or my childhood.
Pretty much, yeah.
That sounds like a recipe for total medical chaos.
It was. And that chaos led directly to a massive crisis of credibility in the 1970s. The sources highlight this landmark study in 1972, the US-UK study led by John Cooper.
Oh, the video one.
Yes. Researchers had noticed that American psychiatrists were diagnosing schizophrenia at several times the rate of British psychiatrists.
Which is strange considering they're fairly similar populations.
Exactly. So they set up an experiment. They took the exact same group of patients, put them on video, and had both sets of doctors evaluate them.
And what happened in the room?
Well, the British doctors looked at the patient's actual behaviors and primarily saw manic depression or personality disorders. But the American doctors saw schizophrenia everywhere.
Everywhere.
Basically, the American definition had become so elastic, so focused on this psychoanalytically flavored search for latent hidden meaning, that practically any severe distress was being labeled as schizophrenia.
So a British doctor says, hey, this person is acting manic. And the American doctor says, but underneath that mania, I detect a fundamental splitting of the ego. Therefore, it's schizophrenia.
That's exactly how it worked.
That is terrifying if you're the patient. I mean, your entire treatment depends on what side of the Atlantic you're on.
It was a disaster for the field's reputation. Think about it. If doctors can't even agree on what a disease looks like in the same patient, how can you research it?
You can't.
How can you test whether a medication works? You can't do that either. So in 1980, a Columbia University psychiatrist named Robert Spitzer led a complete rebellion.
He was the driving force behind DSM-3.
Yes. Spitzer basically threw out all those vague psychoanalytic narratives. He introduced the explicit symptom count checklist that we use today.
So he shifted from the why to the what.
Exactly. He made the manual deliberately atheoretical. The DSM-3 didn't try to explain why a disorder happened, it just described what it looked like.
Right.
That way, a psychoanalyst, a biological psychiatrist, and a behavioral therapist could all look at the exact same patient, count the exact same symptoms, and agree on the label.
Okay, so Spitzer essentially standardized the recipe book to stop American and British chefs from baking completely different cakes with the same ingredients. They all now had to follow the same explicit checklist.
That was the goal.
But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. Standardizing the recipe just means we all agree on how to bake the cake. It doesn't actually prove that the cake tastes good
Oh,
or that it's even a cake at all, right?
that is spot on, and you've just perfectly defined the crucial difference between reliability and validity.
Okay, let's make sure we really define those two for you listening because the sources lean on them heavily and it's super important.
Let's do it. Reliability simply asks, do two different clinicians examining the same patient reach the same diagnosis? Do they agree?
So that's what Spitzer's checklists were designed to fix.
Exactly. Validity, on the other hand, asks, does that diagnostic category actually correspond to something real and distinct in nature?
Right, so you can have high reliability but low validity.
Yes. You can get two doctors to agree perfectly on a category, meaning it is highly reliable. But that category might still not correspond to any real, distinct biological entity. It might just be an arbitrary cluster of symptoms.
And the wild thing from the sources is that even with Spitzer's explicit checklists, they didn't even completely fix the reliability problem.
No, they didn't.
There's this data from the field trials for the newest manual, the DSM-5, published by Regier and colleagues in 2013. They measured reliability using a statistic called a kappa score.
Right, the kappa score measures if doctors agree more than just pure chance. Pure chance is 0, and perfect agreement is 1.
So PTSD scored a decent 0.67.
Which is pretty good.
But major depressive disorder, arguably one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions in the world, scored a 0.28.
Yeah.
A 0.28. That means two highly trained, competent psychiatrists interviewing the exact same depressed patient using the official rulebook are agreeing only slightly more often than a magic 8-ball.
It's shockingly low.
The field trial's own published categories labeled that score as merely questionable.
It is a really sobering statistic. And when you combine shaky reliability with unproven validity, you end up with diagnostic labels that are incredibly sticky.
Sticky.
Yeah. Once a label is applied, it has this immense power to shape how everything else about that person is viewed.
Oh, like the Rosenhan experiment.
Yeah.
The sources bring up that as the perfect example of stickiness.
Exactly. The famous 1973 study.
Yeah. Stanford psychologist David Rosenhan and 7 sane volunteers went to different psychiatric hospitals and faked one single symptom to get admitted.
Just one.
They just told the doctors they were hearing voices saying empty, hollow, and thud.
That was the entirety of the ruse. They didn't fake any erratic behavior, just that one auditory hallucination.
And all 8 were admitted. 7 of them were slapped with a schizophrenia diagnosis.
Which is wild.
But here is the crazy part. Once they got inside the ward, they dropped the act completely. They acted normally.
But the medical staff never figured it out.
No. Because they were looking through diagnosis classes, everything the sane patients did was filtered through the label of schizophrenia.
The way the staff reinterpreted normal behavior is arguably the most striking part of that whole study.
Yes. When a fake patient was just taking notes for the experiment, the nurses didn't think, oh, a researcher.
Right. They recorded it in the medical chart as patient engages in writing behavior.
Framing it as a compulsive psychiatric symptom, the label literally created its own reality.
And then they were kept there for a while, right? Yeah.
They were held for an average of 19 days, and one was kept for 52 days.
Wow.
And when they were finally released, they weren't called sane or misdiagnosed. The doctors discharged them as having schizophrenia in remission.
Now, we do need to add a quick caveat here, because in recent years, Rosenhan's data has faced some posthumous scrutiny.
Right, the Susanna Cahalan book.
Yes. She wrote a book raising serious doubts about how Rosenhan recorded his data and whether he embellished some details.
Which is an important asterisk.
Definitely. But regardless of the flaws in that specific historical study, the core lesson it taught remains a staple of psychiatric training. Confirmation bias is real. Once a label is applied, it colors the entire clinical picture.
This raises an important question. What happens when these questionable, sticky categories inevitably start overlapping with each other?
Well, because they lack that strict biological boundary, they leak into one another constantly. We see massive rates of comorbidity.
Right. And since you're listening to this deep dive, you probably know what comorbidity is, but the sheer scale of it is what really breaks the DSM framework.
It does. According to the National Comorbidity Survey replication that was led by Ronald Kessler, comorbidity is the norm, not the exception.
Meaning?
The vast majority of people who meet the criteria for one DSM disorder also meet the criteria for at least one more.
Which poses a massive philosophical problem. I mean, if you have the flu, you don't automatically get diagnosed with diabetes. distinct physical diseases don't constantly overlap like that. So if comorbidity is this universal in mental health, is it possible we're just drawing arbitrary lines in the sand?
It's highly possible.
We're calling them different diseases, but maybe they're just different branches of the same underlying tree.
That exact realization has sparked major scientific rebellions against the DSM in the last decade.
Rebellions from who?
Well, top researchers. For a long time, the manual has relied on a categorical model. You either have the disorder or you don't.
Like being pregnant.
Exactly. But many researchers argue mental illness is actually dimensional. It's more like blood pressure. Everyone has some level of anxiety or threat response or impulsivity. A disorder is just the moment we arbitrarily decide the pressure has gotten too high.
And that's where the National Institute of Mental Health comes in.
Yes, the NIMH rebellion.
In 2013, right before the DSM-5 came out, Thomas Insel, the director of the NIMH, launched this massive public rebellion.
He stated that the DSM diagnoses lacked biological validity. He actually called the manual a dictionary of labels rather than a biological map.
So NIMH launched RDOC, the research domain criteria.
And the shift RDOC represents is profound. Under the DSM, a researcher might recruit 100 people with major depression for a brain scan study.
But as we discussed with the menu analogy, those 100 people might have wildly different symptoms and biology.
Exactly. It's incredibly noisy data.
So with RDOC, how does that study actually look different?
Well, under RDOC, instead of recruiting based on the DSM label, you study a specific measurable dimension.
Give me an example.
You might recruit people who specifically struggle with reward processing, or anhedonia, which is the inability to feel pleasure.
Okay.
And some of those people might have a depression label, some might have schizophrenia, some might have bipolar disorder. The RDOC framework just ignores the DSM buckets and maps the underlying biological and psychological dimensions across all patients.
Oh, that makes so much sense. But it wasn't just the NIMH rebelling either. The creators of the manual themselves started fighting back.
Yes, Alan Francis is a prime example.
He was the psychiatrist who actually chaired the DSM-IV task force, and he became one of the fiercest critics of the newer DSM-5.
He wrote a book called Saving Normal.
Right. And his core argument was that the new manual was lowering diagnostic thresholds so much that it was medicalizing ordinary human experience.
The clearest example of this in the sources is the removal of the bereavement exclusion.
Which was so controversial.
Very. For decades, the DSM explicitly stated that if you had just lost a loved one, you couldn't be diagnosed with major depression for the first 2 months.
Because it was considered a normal human grieving process.
Exactly. But DSM-5 removed that exclusion.
And Francis and other critics argued that this pathologizes normal human mourning. Like, it turns grief into a medical disease.
Though, to be fair to the other side, the supporters of the change argued that you shouldn't deny someone clinical treatment just because their severe depression was triggered by a death.
All right, both sides have a point there.
They do, and this debate perfectly illustrates why the biopsychosocial model is so essential today.
Oh, proposed by George Engel, right, back in 1977.
That's the one. This model argues we cannot just assume a single biological cause for mental health struggles.
Right. Think about what this looks like in a modern clinic. A doctor isn't just checking off symptoms and writing a prescription for a supposed chemical imbalance.
No, they're looking at biology, yes, like genetics or sleep, but they are equally weighing psychological factors like thought patterns and social factors.
Things like poverty, isolation, or grief.
Exactly. You can't separate the brain from the context of a person's life.
So what does this all mean? Which brings us to a reality that I think a lot of people just overlook.
What's that?
If these diagnoses are not fixed biological facts pulled from nature, but are instead negotiated tools created by human committees, that means they're vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable.
They are vulnerable to cultural shifts, to social bias, and to politics.
They absolutely are. A diagnostic category is not discovered with a telescope like a new planet. It is constructed, debated, and revised by committee vote.
And the clearest proof of this is that homosexuality was officially listed as a mental disorder in the first 2 editions of the DSM.
It was. It was only removed in 1973.
And that removal didn't happen because some scientist suddenly looked under a microscope and found new data. It was driven heavily by gay rights activism, changing social attitudes, and intense internal political pressure within the American Psychiatric Association.
It was a social shift, not a biological discovery. Then you look at the DSM-5 in 2013, where the committee completely eliminated Asperger's syndrome as a standalone diagnosis.
Right, they folded it into the broader autism spectrum disorder.
They did.
And think about what that means for you or someone you know. Imagine going to sleep with a medical identity that defines your community, explains your experiences, and connects you to others, and waking up to find a committee of doctors literally voted it out of existence.
That wasn't just a paperwork change. It caused real grief and an identity crisis for thousands of people who had built a community around that label.
That is the raw power this manual has over everyday lives.
And historically, we've seen how this subjectivity can be weaponized in horrific ways.
Oh, the sources highlight some awful examples of this.
Like in 1851, a physician in the American South named Samuel Cartwright invented a diagnosis called drapetomania.
Which he claimed was a mental disease that caused enslaved people to flee captivity.
Pure pseudoscience. It was an invention to pathologize the entirely rational human resistance to injustice.
And we see it again in the Soviet Union, from the 60s through the 80s. State psychiatrists were diagnosing political dissidents with sluggish schizophrenia,
The supposed symptom being holding anti-Soviet beliefs.
which gave the state a neat medical excuse to lock people up in psychiatric hospitals indefinitely without ever giving them a trial.
So hearing all of this, the committee voting, the subjective checklists, the historical weaponization, the low reliability scores, it is incredibly easy to become cynical.
It really is. A lot of people might listen to this deep dive and think, well, psychiatry is just making it up as they go.
Right, you hear about the magic 8-ball kappa scores and think, throw the whole book away.
But that is an overcorrection, isn't it?
It is. Despite all these massive systemic flaws, the criteria-based system Spitzer introduced in 1980 is still vastly superior to the narrative chaos of the 1960s.
Right. It gives clinicians across the globe a shared language. It allows researchers to actually study treatments in a somewhat systematic way.
And crucially, it allows patients to get their insurance to cover the therapy or medication they desperately need to survive.
It's a flawed tool, but it is a desperately needed one.
Precisely. It is not a hard science, but it is certainly not a sham either. It is an evolving, imperfect human tool.
Yeah.
It produces more replicable results than what we had 50 years ago, and it continues to be updated as our cultural values and our scientific evidence change.
All right, let's bring this home. We have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We learned that psychiatric diagnosis is descriptive, not a biological blood test. We saw how Robert Spitzer's checklists in the 1980s fixed the reliability problem, getting doctors to finally agree on the same labels, but left the validity unproven, meaning those labels can be sticky, overlapping, and somewhat arbitrary.
And we've seen how the DSM is a living document shaped just as much by culture, politics, and committee votes as it is by hard science.
And we want you to remember that this isn't just an abstract history lesson.
No, this manual dictates what research gets funded today, what public health initiatives are launched tomorrow, and what treatments you or your loved ones can access right now.
It is a live, ongoing negotiation about what it means to be human.
Beautifully said.
And on that note, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something that really builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have spent this entire deep dive talking about how human clinicians, experts with decades of nuance and training, struggle to interpret these subjective polythetic checklists. But think about the future. Right now, AI-driven mental health chatbots and diagnostic algorithms are being programmed to ingest this exact diagnostic language. If the manual is this subjective, this culturally dependent, and this prone to bias for human experts, what happens when we hand that fuzzy, incredibly powerful rulebook over to an artificial intelligence to categorize our minds?
That is a staggering thought.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the labels, keep exploring the world around you, and remember, just because there isn't an X-ray to point to doesn't mean the pain isn't real. Catch you next time.